The story of Germany's defeat in World War II does not begin on the battlefield, but in the ambitions and assumptions that shaped the very foundation of the Nazi regime. Germany entered the Second World War with a sense of unstoppable momentum. Its leaders believed they could reshape Europe through speed, intimidation, and the ruthless application of military force. Yet, beneath this confidence lay structural weaknesses, miscalculations, and ideological extremism that would ultimately lead to disaster. In the years before the war, Germany invested heavily in rearmament and military innovation. The world watched with concern as factories hummed day and night, producing weapons, tanks, and aircraft. Hitler and his inner circle believed that war was inevitable and that Germany had a narrow window to strike before its enemies grew stronger. Their plan revolved around rapid, overwhelming attacks designed to break nations before they could mobilize. This was the doctrine of Blitzkrieg, a strategy built on speed, shock, and coordination. Germany's early victories seemed to prove the strategy flawless. In 1939, the invasion of Poland was swift and decisive. German armored divisions cut through enemy lines with precision, supported by aircraft that bombed communication centers and railways. Within weeks, Poland fell. Soon after, Germany turned westward. Denmark and Norway were taken, the Netherlands fell, Belgium collapsed, and France, one of Europe's most powerful nations, surrendered in a matter of weeks. These stunning victories convinced the German leadership that their military machine was unstoppable. But beneath the surface, these early triumphs masked the fragility of Germany's strategic position. Blitzkrieg was expensive, fuel-intensive, and dependent on precise logistics. Germany did not have unlimited industrial capacity or resources. It relied on conquering territory quickly before running out of supplies. The Nazi leadership underestimated how many enemies it would accumulate and how long the war would ultimately last. Germany went to war with insufficient oil, limited raw materials, and a fragile economy that could not support a prolonged global conflict. Another foundational weakness was the structure of the Nazi government itself. Decisions were often made by Hitler personally, who valued loyalty over expertise. Military leaders competed for influence, creating overlapping authorities and conflicting orders. As the war expanded, this chaotic command structure would lead to disastrous decisions at crucial moments. Hitler's belief in his own intuition over the advice of trained generals became one of Germany's most damaging weaknesses. Germany's defeat was also rooted in ideology. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, assuming that Slavic peoples were inferior and incapable of resisting German might. He believed that Britain would eventually seek peace, convinced that the British were part of a racial hierarchy that would prevent them from opposing Germany indefinitely. These assumptions were not military calculations, but ideological fantasies that ignored the realities of geopolitics and national resolve. The turning point began when Germany expanded the war further than its resources and manpower could support. By 1940, the British had refused to surrender. German air raids failed to break British morale. The Royal Air Force held firm. The United Kingdom emerged as a resilient opponent, and Germany failed to achieve air superiority. This setback forced Germany into a long-term conflict, stretching its resources thin. Germany hoped to starve Britain through submarine warfare, but the British adapted, developing new tactics and technologies that eventually turned the tide. Despite these challenges, Germany still believed victory was within reach, until June 1941, when Hitler made the most catastrophic decision of the war: the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in history, involving millions of soldiers across a massive front.
The German leadership believed the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of months. Early victories seemed to validate their plan. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled. Vast territories were captured. But the deeper the Germans pushed into Soviet territory, the more apparent their logistical failures became. The Soviet Union was simply too vast. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. Vehicles broke down, railroads were incompatible with German systems, and as winter approached, German troops found themselves fighting in freezing temperatures without proper gear, clothing, or preparation. German tanks and trucks stalled in deep snow. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold. Soldiers suffered frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion. The Blitzkrieg strategy, designed for rapid victories, collapsed in the face of Soviet resilience in unforgiving weather. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, mobilized its entire population and industry. Factories were moved thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft rolled off assembly lines at breathtaking speed. Soviet manpower, though suffering immense casualties, was vast enough to replace losses that Germany could not. For every German soldier who fell, several Soviet replacements arrived. Germany neither had the population nor the industrial capacity to match this scale.
While Germany struggled in the East, the world shifted dramatically. In December 1941, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, and Germany declared war on America shortly after. This decision sealed Germany's fate. The United States, with the largest industrial economy in the world, now entered the war. American factories produced tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons in quantities Germany could never match. The combined production of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire dwarfed German output many times over. By 1942, Germany was caught in a three-front war, fighting the British in North Africa, the Soviets in the East, and eventually the Americans in Western Europe. Germany's early confidence transformed into desperation. Hitler demanded that his armies hold ground at all costs, refusing to allow strategic retreats. This led to catastrophic losses, most famously at Stalingrad, where an entire German army was encircled and destroyed. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked the beginning of a long, unstoppable Soviet advance westward. Even as Germany fought desperately, the Allies continued to close in. Strategic bombing destroyed German cities, factories, and transportation networks. Fuel production collapsed. German aircraft could barely take off. Tanks sat immobilized, starved of fuel. The once formidable German war machine became a shadow of its former self. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. Germany's strategic situation deteriorated rapidly after the disaster at Stalingrad. For the first time, German commanders began to understand the consequences of fighting a war on multiple fronts against enemies whose combined industrial capacity dwarfed their own. The losses at Stalingrad were not simply military, they were psychological. The German army, once feared as an unstoppable force, now faced the grim reality that the momentum of the war had shifted permanently. The Soviet Union, driven by determination, rage, and a massive industrial engine, moved safely deep into the east, launched counterattacks that pushed the Wehrmacht back month by month, village by village. Every mile retaken came at enormous cost, but the Soviet ability to replace equipment and manpower was something Germany could not match. Entire Soviet tank armies appeared seemingly from nowhere, supplied by endless trains and factories working day and night. Germany, in contrast, struggled to replace even basic equipment. As the Eastern Front collapsed, Germany's leadership faced internal chaos. Hitler refused to acknowledge the scale of the defeat.
He issued orders demanding offensives that were impossible to execute. Generals who attempted to speak honestly about the situation were dismissed, sidelined, or removed entirely. Fear and ideology replaced strategic logic. German officers were forced to choose between military reality and obedience to a leader who no longer understood the war he himself had unleashed. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies prepared for their return to the European mainland. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, British and American bombers launched increasingly devastating air raids across Germany. Cities burned under relentless bombardment. Industrial centers were reduced to rubble. Transportation networks collapsed under the strain. German civilians suffered deeply, their homes destroyed, their families fractured. The Nazi promise of endless victory now gave way to fear and exhaustion. Fuel shortages became one of Germany's most crippling weaknesses. Without oil, aircraft stayed grounded, tanks remained still, and trucks could not deliver supplies. The once dominant Luftwaffe, which had ruled the skies in the early years of the war, was reduced to scattered formations of inexperienced pilots flying obsolete aircraft. American and British fighters patrolled German skies with near total freedom, hunting German planes and supporting ground troops across Europe. Germany attempted to respond with technological innovation, producing advanced weapons such as the jet-powered Me-262 and the V-2 rocket. While impressive, these weapons came too late and in too few numbers to alter the outcome. The jet fighters lacked fuel and trained pilots. The rockets, though terrifying, consumed enormous resources without achieving meaningful strategic impact. Germany spent valuable time and materials chasing miracle weapons instead of focusing on practical tools the army desperately needed. The Allied landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944, became another major turning point. The D-Day invasion opened a new front that Germany could not contain. Despite fierce resistance, the sheer weight of Allied manpower, equipment, and logistics overwhelmed the German defenders. As the Allies pushed inland, German forces found themselves caught between powerful Soviet armies in the east and massive Anglo-American forces in the west. The Third Reich was being squeezed from both sides, its territory shrinking, its armies breaking, its leadership spiraling into denial. Inside Germany, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Food shortages became widespread, infrastructure lay in ruins, millions of refugees fled advancing front lines. Bomb craters scarred the streets of major cities. Factories operated in scattered underground shelters, struggling to produce even a fraction of what was needed. The once confident speeches of the Nazi leadership rang hollow as defeat loomed on every horizon. The German economy, stretched beyond its limits, collapsed under the pressure of total war. Skilled workers had been drafted into the army, leaving factories understaffed. Raw materials ran out. Transportation lines were severed. Every attempt to revive production failed. German soldiers at the front fought with diminishing supplies, sometimes lacking even basic ammunition. The promise of a swift, decisive war had turned into a nightmare of attrition. Morale among German troops plunged. Many soldiers understood the war was lost, but were forced to continue fighting under threat of execution. The relentless advance of the Soviet army created an atmosphere of terror among both soldiers and civilians. Tales of atrocities, often fueled by propaganda, but sometimes brutally real, spread panic across the German populace. Civilians fled westward in massive waves, seeking safety from the destruction advancing toward their homes. Hitler's decisions grew increasingly irrational. He forbade retreats, even when necessary to save lives. He ordered counterattacks that were doomed from the start. He moved phantom divisions that did not exist on maps, convinced that sheer willpower could change the tide of the war. In his bunker, cut off from reality, he clung to delusions of victory, while the nation collapsed around him. By late 1944, Germany's position was hopeless. The failure of the Ardennes offensive, often called the Battle of the Bulge, marked Germany's final attempt to seize the initiative. The plan was bold but unrealistic. German forces lacked fuel, manpower, and vehicles to sustain such an attack. Initial gains collapsed quickly, and the offensive drained what was left of Germany's resources. It was the last gasp of a military machine nearing its end. The Allied armies pushed across the Rhine, advancing rapidly through a Germany that could no longer resist effectively. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Union launched massive offensives that shattered the remaining German defenses. Entire cities fell within days. The Red Army advanced toward Berlin with relentless determination, driven by vengeance, patriotism, and the desire to end the war once and for all. By early 1945, the Third Reich was surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and internally fragmented. German civilians faced starvation and destruction. The army was reduced to boys and old men, hastily conscripted into desperate defense units. German leadership, drowned in paranoia and despair, lost its grip on reality. The world around them burned while they clung to fantasies of secret weapons and last-minute miracles. Germany's collapse was no longer a slow decline. It was an avalanche.
Germany entered 1945 as a nation on the edge of complete destruction. Entire regions lay in ruins. Millions of civilians fled from the east as the Soviet advance grew closer, carrying whatever they could in wagons, suitcases, or bare hands. Hunger and exhaustion marked every face. Cities that once symbolized German strength and culture were now smoldering landscapes of shattered stone and twisted metal. The promise of a 1,000-year Reich had collapsed into a desperate struggle for mere survival. The German army, once the most feared fighting force in Europe, was now a patchwork of shattered divisions. Many units were formed from teenagers and elderly men pulled from the Volkssturm, the home guard created in the final months of the war. These new recruits had little training and almost no equipment. They fought alongside the remnants of seasoned soldiers who were weary, wounded, and hopelessly outnumbered. Ammunition was scarce, fuel was nearly non-existent, and morale had evaporated. Yet they continued to fight, driven by fear, duty, or the simple instinct to defend their homeland. In the east, the Soviet Union launched one of the largest offensives in human history. Millions of Soviet soldiers advanced toward Berlin, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery guns, and aircraft. The Eastern Front had always been brutal, but in 1945 it reached levels of destruction almost unimaginable. Cities fell one after another as Soviet forces carved through the remaining German defenses. The Red Army pressed forward with unstoppable momentum, determined to reach Berlin before the Western Allies. Berlin itself had already been devastated by years of Allied bombing. Entire districts were flattened. Streets were filled with rubble. Civilians lived in basements, shelters, and shattered apartments. Food was nearly impossible to obtain. Fires burned uncontrollably after air raids, casting an orange glow across the city at night. Shells landed daily. The people of Berlin lived in fear of both the destruction outside and the collapse happening inside the German government.
Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler isolated himself in a fortified bunker. Removed from reality, he issued impossible orders to divisions that no longer existed. He shifted imaginary armies on maps, convinced that a counterstrike could still turn the tide. His trusted commanders increasingly lied to him, afraid to deliver the truth. The bunker became a world disconnected from the suffering above, a final refuge for a leader who refused to accept defeat. As April 1945 began, the Soviet armies closed in on Berlin from the north, south, and east. The final battle for the city was intense and destructive. Artillery fire rained on Berlin relentlessly. Buildings collapsed, flames consumed entire blocks. German soldiers fought from street to street, from house to house, attempting to slow the Soviet advance. They dug trenches in parks, fortified subway tunnels, and turned intersections into defensive positions. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. The Soviet forces pushed forward ruthlessly, determined to capture the city that symbolized Nazi power. Tanks rolled through streets littered with debris. Soldiers battled through factories, government buildings, and apartment complexes. The fighting was close, brutal, and relentless. Every hour, the German defenders were forced deeper into the city center. Every hour, the inevitability of defeat became clearer. Inside the bunker, Hitler finally understood that all hope was gone. The promises of miracle weapons, phantom divisions, and secret negotiations had all evaporated. The Reich he envisioned would not survive. As Soviet troops fought their way toward the Chancellery, Hitler chose to end his life rather than face capture. On April 30th, 1945, he committed suicide, leaving behind a nation spiraling into devastation. His inner circle soon followed, each choosing their own way to escape the consequences of a war they had helped unleash. With its leadership gone and its military in ruins, Germany surrendered unconditionally just days later. The guns went silent, the streets stopped shaking. The war in Europe was over, but the cost was staggering. Tens of millions dead, cities destroyed, families broken, and continents scarred. Germany's defeat was complete and absolute.
And yet, when historians study why Germany lost World War II, the answer is not found in a single event or a single battle. It lies in a chain of decisions rooted in arrogance, ideology, miscalculation, and a profound underestimate of its enemies. Germany launched a war it was not prepared to sustain. It spread itself across too many fronts. It relied on rapid victories instead of long-term strategy. It ignored the industrial realities of a global conflict. It allowed ideology to replace logic, cruelty to replace diplomacy, and delusion to replace strategy. By attacking nations with larger populations, deeper economies, and stronger alliances, Germany forged a coalition against itself that it could never defeat. Britain remained defiant. The Soviet Union proved resilient. The United States became an industrial giant of unparalleled scale. Each of these nations alone posed a major threat. Together, they were an unstoppable force. In the end, Germany lost not because it lacked courage or skill on the battlefield, but because it lacked the strategic wisdom to match its ambition. Its leadership believed the world could be conquered quickly and reshaped by sheer force. But world wars are not won by speed alone. They are won by endurance, adaptability, resources, and unity. Germany had none of these in the long term. What remains is a lesson written in the ruins of cities and the memories of millions. The war revealed the danger of unchecked power, destructive ideology, and leaders who mistake conviction for competence. It stands as a warning to future generations that domination built on cruelty, fear, and aggression is destined to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. As Europe began to rebuild and the world entered a new era, the legacy of Germany's defeat shaped global politics, international cooperation, and the pursuit of peace. The consequences of the war continue to echo through history, reminding us that the cost of such conflict is too great to ever be forgotten. Germany's downfall was not simply the end of a war. It was the end of a dark chapter in human history, a chapter written with violence, ambition, and tragedy. And in its collapse, the world learned once more that no empire, no ideology, and no leader can escape the consequences of war built on hatred and domination.
This has been WarChronica. If this story moved you, subscribe and join us as we uncover more moments that shaped our world. Your support keeps this history alive.